Hello, everyone. Welcome to Justice Redesign, where we spotlight justice systems that work, expose those that don't, and explore actionable solutions for systemic change. I'm Steve Teskey, retired judge from the metro Atlanta area. Before that, a trial attorney, and before that, 10 years law enforcement. We focus on personal narratives, expert analysis, with a commitment to fostering equity and fairness. And I ask my listeners to reimagine what justice can and should be. Today, it is my privilege to introduce to you and have with me as a guest Senator Whitney Westerfield. Now, he's retired senator just recently, okay, but was in the Senate for quite a number of years. He's a dedicated public servant and a champion for justice from Christian County, Kentucky. Senator Westerfield served in the Kentucky State Senate, where he was widely recognized for his leadership on criminal justice reform, juvenile justice, and public safety. During his tenure, he chaired the Senate Judiciary Committee, playing a key role in shaping policies that have had a lasting impact on Kentucky's legal system. His legislative efforts focused on improving protections for victims, enhancing due process, advancing evidence-based reforms to create a more effective and fair justice system. Beyond his work in the Senate, Senator Westerfield has been a steadfast advocate for children and families, leading initiatives to improve foster care, mental health services, and juvenile justice programs. His commitment to these causes has earned him respect across party lines and among diverse stakeholders in the legal and social services communities. As I said, he's a native of Christian County. Senator Westerfield has remained deeply engaged in his community, continuing to serve as an advocate for justice and good governance. His integrity, expertise, and passion for public service make him a distinguished leader in Kentucky and, quite frankly, beyond Kentucky. So, Senator Westerfield, thank you so much for joining us here today.
I appreciate it, Judge. I don't know who you were introducing, but none of that's me. I'm just a small town country lawyer who decided to run for office at some point, and is now out of
Well,
office. I appreciate it.
well, I've known you for a long time. I think we first met in 2013
Yeah,
in
way back. Yeah,
Lexington.
that's right. Back at the very beginning, my
We,
very first year in the legislature, and when I started all this work.
yes, and we were both going through the Henry Toll Fellowship program that about a 40-hour program that week, pretty intensive, if I recall.
It was, and right here in Kentucky, gave everybody a chance to explore Lexington and explore some leadership capacity and learn about and how we interact with one another. And I still remember fondly our Toll Fellowship experience. Would recommend anybody listening to this, if you're a legislator or a judge or another part of government in elected office or appointed office, seek out the CSG Toll Fellowship program.
Absolutely, I concur. Really enjoyed it. It helped me and sharpen my skills, and I think to make me no doubt, to be a more effective judge, a better listener, okay,
That's right.
as well. Yeah. But before we get into some of the topics around your work as a senator, let's talk about what you're doing now. Yeah,
Well,
you
just
said
a couple of minutes ago, Judge, I was changing diapers on triplets, which are now in the nursery next to me. So that's what I'm doing right now. Other than
yeah.
that,
So
I'm staying busy with my new job.
okay, well, let's make a segue into this new job with your kids, okay? And share with the audience, why is it that you retired from the Senate? That was last year you retired,
It was. So
correct?
I finished at the end of calendar 24. Um, when I ran for office, I had aspirations for even higher office than the office I ran for, obviously, like a lot of people that run for office do. But we didn't have any children. My wife and I had only been married a few years at that time. And then over time, we started having kids. And, for a while, your kids aren't old enough. They don't know that you're gone. And where I live in Kentucky, it's about a 3 hour one way trip up to the state capitol. And during session, for those that pay attention to general assemblies and state legislatures, all but a couple of them around the country are part time. And you're there during session, you're there during the week, and then you get to come home on the weekends, generally speaking. And it's really that way for about a quarter of the year. and I'd be gone, and the kids wouldn't be old enough to know that I was gone. But over the last several years, they got to know very much that I was gone. They were getting old enough to understand where I was and what I was doing, at least a little bit better. And it got hard for them and hard for me, hard for my wife, just to be gone. It's a personal sacrifice, a professional sacrifice to be there and devote yourself to that public policy work that you're doing. And I was happy to do that. And I still miss the policy work. That part of the job was where I flourished and what I enjoyed the most. And I missed getting to do that and having a vote in the Senate with 37 other Kentuckians to do good policy work. But the math didn't work out anymore. It was just too big a sacrifice for my family. And at the time I made the decision and I announced that I wasn't going to run for re-election last year, I announced it in 23. At the time I announced it, I didn't know what God had up his sleeve for my family.
Tell us about that.
Well, about 7 months or so, right at the end of calendar 23, my wife and I adopted embryos again. And all of our children are adopted. One is a domestic adoption, but the other children are all embryo adoptions, where we adopted an embryo that others had, still frozen somewhere, and then they were transferred, and my wife carried them to term and delivered them. Our oldest son, who is 7, is an adopted embryo, and then we adopted others in the interim over the last few years, and those didn't survive. But then we adopted 3 in the fall of 23. We transferred 2 of them, and both of them survived, and then one of those split, giving us triplets. All 3 boys born. So that was, we had already announced we weren't going to run for re-election, and God knew why I needed to be at home before we did. And so babies were born last year on the 4th of July. All 3 boys, happy and healthy and at home and growing, pooping, peeing, and eating all the time.
Well, and you know me, like you, I'm very much a spiritual person, and I do believe that we open up our lives, the Creator, God, is going to take advantage of that in a good way. And so, He knew 3 were coming. You didn't know, but I think there was something else going in your head. You probably couldn't put your finger on it, other than the fact that it's family, which means a lot to you.
It does. It's the most important thing.
Yeah. And and so here you are, okay, back in Hopkinsville,
Yep.
probably most of the time now.
Yep.
Okay. But in addition to your law practice, though, I think you're a director, okay, of policy development. Yeah, tell us about that.
For a number of years, I've been the general counsel for our area's community mental health center. A few years ago, the board of directors decided to merge with another community mental health center based in Bowling Green, Kentucky, about an hour and a half east of me, and combined, and they merged successfully 5 years ago. I continued to stay board counsel for that new merged organization, and they brought me in-house when I left office. So I'm the director of legal and governmental affairs for Life Skills Incorporated, which is one of Kentucky's largest now community mental health centers that covers 18 counties in central and western Kentucky, south central and western Kentucky. We provide services for, I should know this, but I just started in January and I'm still learning some of the stats. I want to say maybe the better part of 30,000 unduplicated Kentuckians across our 18 counties. If you include all the lives that we represent and serve in those 18 counties, it's many hundreds of thousands of people. But we're a safety net behavioral health provider, and continuing to do the best we can with Medicaid dollars and so forth. Obviously, what's happening in D.C. has certainly gotten our attention.
I could imagine.
The bulk of my work is still practicing law for Life Skills Inc. And representing them in all manner of legal issues, contractual and corporate governance and personnel and litigation and what have you. But then I do some government affairs. There's a law in Kentucky. I'm not permitted to lobby my former colleagues for a couple of years in the legislature. But as I said, in those 18 counties, we've got 18 judge executives, for one for each county. We've got uh, a few dozen municipalities and city councils and all kinds of lower level local government that need to be educated about what life skills offers their community, not to mention our folks in D.C. and Kentucky's congressional delegation, those 8 members, 6 in the House and our 2 senators. So I've got my work cut out for me.
Oh, yes, you do. And, you know, it seems to me as much as I know about, you know, your tenure as a senator and the things that you champion, that really you're just, uh, you know, you're still on the same path. Okay.
I
Uh,
appreciate that. I'd like to
yeah,
think that I am too. It was a natural transition, and I get to do and work in the same policy space that I have for the last 12 years in the Senate. And it means a lot. As someone who's worked on policy from the bench, who's advocated and talked about various juvenile justice policies and what works, what doesn't work, not just in Georgia but around the country. Um, it's gratifying when you know you're doing something good that's helping
yeah.
people that are in need, that's addressing a need that exists in an area, a community, small or large. And I shudder to think what any of our states around the country would do without our community mental health centers, our behavioral health providers.
Oh,
Um, and so I'm glad to work for an organization that I believe in.
well, I certainly commend you, and I was so glad that when I looked you up and saw what you were doing, and I said, "Wow, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised he's doing that." And, you know, and you and I kind of mirror. You know, my retirement. My wife had already we had already planned in 2017 that to retire around 2021. Okay, and so. In fact, I was born in Tucson, Arizona. As you know, that's where I am now. And so we decided to retire in Tucson because it's a shorter distance to Montana, where my wife was raised up and has family and friends there. And so she likes to mountain bike. Well,
Nice.
we don't like driving from Atlanta to Montana, so she never got to take her mountain bike. Now she gets
No
to
one
take her
likes
mountain
driving
bike.
to or from Atlanta, to or from anywhere else.
That's right. Very good
A
point, you know.
universally held opinion about Atlanta traffic.
That's right. That's right. Top 10 worst in the country, they say. Um, but you know, when COVID hit, and keep in mind, in the judicial retirement system of Georgia, when you hit 16 years of service, you're not any year after that, you're not adding very much at all to your pension check. Okay. But I went on to serve to 23 years. But when so we had already bought a home in Tucson in 2020 in preparation of my retirement in 2021. But we went ahead and bought the home because we were thinking I might retire even before 2021. But when COVID hit, it really changed my world as a juvenile court judge because I was very accustomed to coming down from the bench, greeting the parents and the kids, sitting with them when it was appropriate to sit with them, like an informal hearing, a disposition hearing, not trials, of course, which I think is very appropriate in juvenile court to try to create that professional relationship that you care and that I want you to succeed type of thing. And but when COVID hit, next thing you know, I'm in my chambers on Zoom, okay, conducting court,
Right.
and I didn't get to have that personal connect, and it was no longer fun. And that's when my wife, when I would come home and complain about that, she said, "You're miserable, honey. Why don't you just go ahead and retire?" You know, and we did. But I want to say this: I'm now I'm in my office now, and I'm now working for the Pascua Yaqui Pueblo tribe, and I represent their Department of Social Services, and so I do child welfare protection and adult protection.
You
And
made a similar
like you,
transition then, Judge.
That's it. That's it. That's it. But let's talk about, you know, let's start off this way. You have championed so many things, okay? But I want my audience, my viewers, I want to put this in context for them. Now, you're not just a state senator, but you are a Republican. You ran as a Republican and remain as a Republican, correct?
That's correct.
Yes, and that hasn't changed.
No, I
You've
can't
always
say
been a
that the
Republican.
party hasn't changed a lot, but my Republican values are what they were 20 years ago.
Yeah, and I have a feeling that some of the questions I'm going to ask you might bring that out, because there's been some similar experiences in Georgia with the criminal and juvenile justice reforms we did under Governor Deal, who was a staunch
Yeah,
Republican, okay? And ironically, all our legislation uh, passed unanimously, both House and Senate controlled strongly by the Republicans in Georgia. But, now there's questions being raised about that. And I think because there's a different tone
yeah. I think
that's
we can get
going on.
into it more later if you want, or now. But I think the landscape has radically changed, and I don't think there's a red legislature in America that would do what Georgia did 10, 15 years ago, which
Yeah,
is a
yeah,
shame.
yes, yes. And so that's what I want to get into because, you know, still, you know, I've always believed that um, that conservatism and its core values, okay, as I know them to be, and I say that because I've, like you, have had to work both sides of the aisle. I've been to the legislature every session, every year from 2008 when I was president of the Council of Juvenile Court Judges until I retired, and asked by many Republicans if I would come testify on their legislation that was, seeking changes for the positive using what the evidence shows
That's right.
would be a more appropriate practice. Okay. Um, but some of my thoughts was that, because we know that historically, what has been dubbed as a conservative approach as being tough on crime, it turns out that historically much of the legislation has been more the optical approach of tough. That is, it looks tough.
Yeah,
When when the question is, we need to define toughness by the outcomes. Would you agree with that?
I would. I would
Yes.
completely.
Okay.
I think that has well, and it's also it's been I think primarily driven by what messages best back home. Um, Without going into detail, because it's a longer conversation, Kentucky just last year passed a bill, a Republican sponsored bill. I was the only Republican to vote against it in the Senate. Uh, I had to bargain not to make radical changes to it just to get the bill referred to my committee, which is where the bill ought to have been sent without any debate,
and
without
that
any
was the
question.
Judiciary Committee?
It was.
Okay.
Been the chair since my first day on the job. So I chaired the committee for 12 straight years. And I, it's frustrating to see that sort of bill come through when I know the legislators don't understand all the parts of it. It was a big omnibus criminal justice bill, and there were two or three parts that I think everybody could agree with, but the rest of it was just a crap sandwich. To be crass about it, it was a mess. But it gave them something to talk about back home. I was tough on these folks. The problem though is that that's as detailed analysis of the messaging as the constituents are ever going to get. If you wanted to know more about why the bill really wasn't going to accomplish those ends, you could go and find it. But most voters, most constituents aren't going to hear that. They're going to go to the
Right.
town hall or see the little update on Facebook that the legislator puts out there or the tweet they put out there that says, I made it tougher to do blah, 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 or I was harder on these dangerous criminals. And there's no next level analysis, deeper analysis of what you really did. And those deeper analyses never message. You can't put that on a bumper sticker. You can't put it in a
Right.
radio spot or on a push card in a campaign, but you can say tough on criminals. And that message works really well and it's persuasive. And if you don't care enough to get into the nitty-gritty details of a bill, it's really tempting for legislators to jump on that and ride it.
No, you're so I agree completely. After in 2020, I was approached by the Georgia Law Review, and they had asked me if I would write an article on our experience of the process and why was it so effective, to be able to achieve the type of changes, let's say and I focused on the juvenile justice side of it, given the fact that both House and Senate was controlled by the Republicans, and that what we were doing didn't look tough, just it didn't look it. Okay. In fact, if anything, it looks softer. Okay. And that doesn't go so well with politicians for the reason that what their constituents may say back home if they vote on something like that. Okay. And so I wrote, and in fact, I have it hanging on my wall right here, but it's titled a collective process um, you know uh, to basically reduce or eliminate the politicization of crime and punishment. Okay, and the process is so important. And I think that's why we were able to be effective. But I do agree with you. If it went through it today, the the the, the world is so politics today is so much different than in the last decade that I don't even think this process would have worked because there's
No.
already yeah a predetermination of what things should be and look like, nonetheless. But I do want to go back. So you get elected, you're chairing the Senate Judiciary Committee. What inspired you as a Republican, as a conservative, to push the type of reforms that, I'll just be frank about it, by many Republicans and conservatives look soft on crime?
Well, I had been a prosecutor before I ran for office. Uh, in fact, I was still a prosecutor when I filed to run for office, and then resigned. Could have stayed there in hindsight, but resigned and campaigned and did my private practice full time in the balance of 2012. And God blessed me with that victory. And I had strong opinions about specific policies, some that weren't related to criminal justice at all, obviously, as someone who wanted to run for office. But I had really strong opinions about some criminal justice work, including some that my former colleague and friend that you know as well, then Chairman John Tilley, had worked on
Hmm.
from the House side. And he's a Democratic member of the House in Kentucky at the time, and was also from Hopkinsville. Um, there were a couple of things that he had done that I completely disagreed with, but I disagreed with him because I was wearing a prosecutorial hat and I was wearing these blinders that just I had a focus on being a prosecutor. When you get to be a policymaker, I think you're obligated to take those blinders off. I think you've got a duty to not just be a prosecutor that gets to vote on legislation any more than I should be a defense attorney that votes on legislation, or a farmer that votes on legislation, or a fill in the blank. I've got to appreciate the entire landscape of policy work. How does it affect all the people that are in this particular area? How does it affect everyone that's involved in this system? And when you see the data, when you look at the numbers, man, we had a terrible system. We continue to have a terrible system in a lot of regards, adult and juvenile alike in Kentucky. The bill I mentioned earlier has made it worse in some very measurable and objectively worse ways. But I had an eye for doing certain things when I got in the seat. And then I found out early on in 2013, really early on, Chairman, there had been a bill filed last year that created this task force to look at Kentucky's juvenile code. And it sort of didn't go anywhere. If you're interested, we could draft that again if you wanted to create that and do it over again, and be more, if it's something you'd be interested in doing. And I took that and ran with it. We got involved, started that work. It was one of the first things I had passed in the legislature. And then Chairman Tilly and I went to an event held by Pew. And to make a long story short, we managed to recruit Pew to come back to Kentucky. They had been here before on a bill. And they helped us crunch our own numbers, pull our own data, extract it from places where we weren't already gathering it because we weren't doing that very responsibly at all, and helped show what was happening in Kentucky that none of us could see, but all of us sensed that we're in the system in one way or another, that we were punishing children more harshly than their adult counterparts, that we were holding them in out of place or out of home placements more than we should have. We were doing all of this, and it was costing taxpayers a fortune compared to community-based treatment. And we were accelerating kids' involvement in the justice system without trying to divert them from the system at the front end as early as we could for kids that don't have any history. We were setting them up for failure and paying more to boot. And when you see all those numbers, man, they smack you in the face. And nobody that's conscientious, nobody, it doesn't matter what party, you can't look at the numbers we saw. You can't look at the data, what dollars we were spending and what outcomes we were getting and not realize something had to change. I'd like to think nobody else
Okay.
would do that, but that's what got me fired up. And ever since then, it's been a hobby horse to try to show everybody, look at what we're doing. If there was ever a chance to make a difference in the life of a Kentuckian or a Georgian or an Arizonan or Montanan, whatever, it's when they're a child and they're still learning, when they're still figuring out what they're supposed to do and what they're not supposed to do, how to make a mistake and how to learn from that mistake and improve themselves and make them a better adult. And we were blowing it. And we could still do a ton better than we are doing today. But we were doing a terrible job. And that lit the fire under what eventually became Senate Bill 200 and a bill or a subject area that I worked on for the rest of my time in the legislature.
Yeah, you and Representative Tilly brought me up.
We did.
If I recall, to testify, and I was happy to do it. And you're speaking on something that I remember a judge up in New York once shared with me, and he said he says I like to ask folks this question, you know, how would you like the rest of your life to be defined by something stupid you did when you were 14
Isn't
years
that the truth, man? Just
old?
look around at other legislators. All of us have something like that, right? There's not a
Yeah,
person in the room just about that's lived a life free of really boneheaded things they did when they were a teenager, or even illegal things that some of them have done when they were a teenager, but they got away with, or they had help with because they were well connected, or whatever, because they were white and not black. Whatever the issue is,
yeah.
they avoided the justice system, and so many others don't.
Yeah, good point. And and you were mentioning, as Pew was helping you go through, I call it a data dumping, where they take your data in the juvenile justice system, and then they do their analysis work on it. Okay, and they did the same for us in Georgia, and it was amazing the things that we learned about how many low risk kids we were putting in our youth
That's
prisons.
right.
Okay, and that our recidivist rate within 3 years was 65% of those kids. And we all know that we place the wrong kids into a long-term confinement, we are actually causing them to become worse,
We are.
to be a more serious criminal. And many of these low risks are really not criminals when it comes to youth in the first place. They're just adolescents who,
Screwed up.
because they're screwed up. We know that their frontal lobe isn't developed till age,
They
25, and
screwed
so
up,
they're
or
prone.
the peer pressure that they were exposed to led them to screw up, or whatever, or childhood trauma set them on a path that's different from the next kid's path. I mean, they still make a decision to do what they do, illegal or not. But you're a fool, and I don't use that term lightly, you're a fool if you don't believe that all those other factors weigh on how you decide to behave in this way or that when faced with this set of circumstances or the next. If you don't think you're not if you don't think you're a product of your childhood experiences and your background, if you don't think you're a product of the environment you grow up in and a product of the pressures on you, then you're intentionally, willfully blind and ignorant to how life works. And,
Yeah,
and kids that end up in these positions, we're not doing them any favors by punishing them overly harshly when they're trying to figure things out and they're trying to learn. And sometimes they got to learn by screwing up.
so you're touching on something that, I reached back and pulled out my notes on conservative values that go back to knowing that I was going to be talking to, legislators and mostly conservative Republicans, okay,
Yeah.
and helping them understand, okay. What you're touching on right now, one of the core values I have written down that is a conservative core value, and I know you'll agree with this, is strengthening families and communities.
100%.
Okay. So, and I have a note here that if we take a look at our tough on crime policies, the ones that look tough, harsher, longer sentences, not being smart on crime, and assessing which kids really are the ones who scare us and are a public safety issue versus those who really are not, okay? But they can result in broken families, these type of policies.
Absolutely. They do result in broken families. You can find those stories all over the place. And then generational harm. The number of people that I prosecuted as a prosecutor whose dad had been through the system before, or whose son was in the system now. I mean, it would knock your socks off. It's not like a majority of the population, but it's a noticeable amount of cases that come through. And I'm just one guy with one experience in one part of Kentucky. But the Kentuckians in Christian County are a lot like the Kentuckians in the other 119 counties in the Commonwealth. You'd have to be willfully ignorant to not appreciate the kind of harm these policies do. The problem is it's that next level analysis that none of them want to do.
Yeah.
None of them want to engage in. It makes me think of a story we had in 2013 when we were working on that bill. And we had school administrators in Kentucky and other states have tried using parts of Senate Bill 200. A lot of states have looked at what Georgia did too. And both of our states have parts and pieces of our bills throughout all the rest of the country. You can see our work there, and I'm so proud of that. But when we had the bill come up, and every state's different, and every state there's a stakeholder group here or there that gets their hackles up and really defensive and tries to kill the bill or the effort. In Tennessee, judges were a big problem with their effort to get something off the ground. In fact, prevented them from getting something meaningful off the ground, I think, at all.
I recall that.
A few years back. In Kentucky, school administrators were the biggest impediment. They were working against the bill behind our back. They'd come in and they'd testify in my committee or in the Juvenile Justice Task Force committee meetings, and they would say all the right things and pledge to work and talk to us about what would be the solution. But when they were genuinely honest, it would only be in my office when cameras weren't on and the audience wasn't there and the rest of the task force wasn't there. And they would say, and did say to my face, "Whitney, we want the hammer. We want to be able to get that kid out of the classroom, get him out of our hair." Now, what they wouldn't say in the room was that they were worried about money, daily average attendance, which affects their funding. They were worried about the bottom line and not about the welfare of that human being child. They weren't ultimately first worried about how that child can succeed. What can we do for that little boy or girl, or that big boy or girl? Could be a 16 or 17-year-old.
Yeah.
What can we do to help them be better? That wasn't their first priority. And if you ask me, and you are asking me to expound on this, I don't think it was in their top 10 priorities, to be completely frank. But I won and they lost. I got the bill passed. But One of those school administrators said that to me in my room, that we need the hammer. We want the hammer. Dropping the hammer on them, they were saying. And it tells you really what kind of environment we were dealing with at the time. They'd rather just do the swift thing and get them out of their hair. They didn't care where they went. Alternative school, detention in McCracken County, that's Paducah for us in Western Kentucky. All of our kids go to McCracken County that get detained. And most of those school administrators have never set foot in that facility and don't know it's got razor wire, concertina wire. It's got door locks and a central command hub, just like your county jail does. I'd like to think, I'd certainly hope that a lot of those educators, if they understood the environment they were putting those kids in, and maybe if they had taken a beat to understand more about that kid's background, their family, where they've come from, what they've had to deal with, maybe they would have been a little slower to drop the hammer on them that way, or want so badly to drop the hammer on them, and instead do something different. And as you said just a moment ago, tailor the solution to fit that kid, because that kid's situation is different from the next kid. There's a great Frederick Douglass quote, and I've talked about it often. I've repeated it often. It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men.
Oh, yes.
If we had just invested better in the life of the child when they were a child, imagine how much better a difference it could make generationally and long term. The trajectory of their life can radically change for the better, instead of sending them deeper into the justice system. And we were accomplishing that very well. We could do so much better.
Well, Senator, here's the thing. One of my guests that I had just last week, Judge Jay Corpeny, Julius, but we call him Jay. He likes to be called Jay. He's from North Carolina, okay, Wilmington. He's the 5th Judicial District Judge, and he was describing about he was telling the audience about when he first met me in 2012, and it was up in a Manhattan hotel, a national convening, and I was presenting my paper, and it was on my school justice partnership that you're familiar with, which is the collaboration between the police and the schools and the courts, and including, of course, behavioral health services in the county and social services. But be that as it may, he talked about the outcomes. He said, he talked about bringing me and my team up there. We helped them. They ended up working out an agreement. It's still in effect, going stronger than ever before. But this is what happened when I asked him, and I want to ask you, be thinking about this, you were talking about measurable outcomes, okay? And so if you could share, what were the outcomes of yours? But I want to say this before you do, and just give you a moment to think about that, is that he said our graduation rates went up, and he told me, he said, Steve, he said, I often quote you when you say, who would ever think that keeping kids in school would increase graduation rates? Okay. But he said this, but here's the thing. You told us this would happen. And within about 3 years, we started seeing the juvenile crime rate go down. Okay. All right. And so we were doing the conservative thing. Okay. We were doing the smart thing. All right. We were not only enhancing public safety in the school, but it ended up resonating out in the community. Okay. All right. And all doing things that did not involve a hammer. Because if we use a hammer, then all kids become a nail.
Sure enough, do.
Okay. So talk about the reforms that y'all did in this way, juvenile justice and so forth. Y'all measured them, I presume. And so did they resonate in a positive way in terms of public safety?
So they did and didn't, depending on your audience. Before the bill passed, again, school administrators And there's a subset of them in Kentucky. They're called directors of pupil personnel. Essentially, this is an oversimplification, but in charge of school discipline. I remember us going to a conference of directors of pupils of personnel for Kentucky. I don't know, a month or two after session ended and the bill was enacted, but not yet in effect. In fact, we had a delayed implementation to get everybody a better part of a year to wind up for it. But I remember in all my 12 years, there's not a group that hated me more and hated what I had to say more than that group did. It was a change to what they were used to doing. And it was a change, and it forced them to do something that tailored solutions to each child instead of just getting them out of their hair. And I understand why they were so opposed to it, but most of them have come around. And when we've measured our system before, and then when you look at what we've done after the fact, we've been able to divert the vast majority of cases away from the justice system entirely. So juveniles have a chance to be kids and screw up, to make mistakes that don't set them on a path that gets them into the system or gets them deeper into the system. We've given them a couple of chances to do that, as a matter of fact. There are some rough edges, some of those because of compromises we made to get the bill through, where we didn't reach quite as far as we'd like. And then there's some other things where we have completely failed to do. We didn't address racial disparities in the system at all in the bill. And the bill was very successful at helping clear the system of a lot of kids, but most of those kids that got the benefit of diversion look like me and you. And they don't look like the black and brown kids that make up the vast majority of the deep end of the population in our system. It showed, it really put in stark relief just how racially divided our system is. The deeper you are in the system, the more likely you are to be black or brown in Kentucky. It highlights a need for additional policy work that unfortunately I was unsuccessful in getting passed, and that I'm not certain that this legislature or the next is going to be eager to address. In this age of anti-DEI stuff, where everything that talks about race is just DEI, whether or not it falls into that category or not. But nobody's got the nerve to touch that and to stand up and say, black and brown kids aren't getting the same shake that the white kids are. They're not getting the same opportunities at diversion that the white kids are. They're not getting the same chance for success. And in some instances, not all this isn't always the case, but in some instances, they don't have the apparatus around them to support them the way that a white kid does, or might. That's not universally true, but you can find lots of examples where that's true. So our legislation has been wildly successful, and we've been able to do a lot of good work. And our crime rates have gone down. Our detention rates have gone down. So we've been able to reduce population in our system without seeing some explosive uptick in juvenile crime. And I will say there has been a bit of a bump back up post-COVID, but it's only because there was a plummet right after COVID. So there's been a post-COVID adjustment, but we're if you see the chart over a decade, it's still trending down. Notwithstanding the COVID hiccup there. So we've been really successful. There are still, though, some prosecutors in here and there, not so much judges, and the school administrators. There's a couple of them that still make a little bit of noise and talk to their prosecutors about it. But there have been efforts to try to peel back some of what we've done, and none of it is informed by any sort of data. It's all anecdotal stuff. It's the same sort of stuff we put up with when we passed the bill in the first place. There was a story about another school administrator, this one from Owensboro, and he told a story about how this girl did something wrong on a Friday. We put her in detention over the weekend. Well, she didn't step a toe out of line on Monday. And that resonates really strongly with people, but the data doesn't support doing that at all. For most kids, that is the worst possible thing you could do. Because while they're there, you're exposing them to the worst influences possible. Not to mention it costs taxpayers more money, but you're giving them opportunities to learn from the worst offenders that we've got in the system. We've got you're taking them away from any positive influences, whether it's the school administrator or a school resource officer, not to mention mom and dad or a grandparent or a neighbor or pastor or whomever. It's just that message is so well, and it really it spoke volumes about the mindset people have. Once you stop and consider the harm that sort of reaction and response from a policy standpoint does, I think you've got no choice but to do something different. But it's hard to make that change, and nobody likes to change.
Senator, what you just that anecdotal story reminds me when I was a young judge. Okay, we're talking about 1999, not too long appointed to the bench, and I had this mom and her son in front of me, and uh, she wanted him detained, okay, to remain in detention, and he what he did didn't deserve that. It wasn't justified, okay? But she just wanted to teach him a lesson, and she was
Oh
getting
man,
pretty upset about it. Yeah. So as much as I'm trying to convince her that there are people that we have over there, okay, that are some really, serious kids that are gangbangers,
yeah.
okay? Well, well, you know what I did? But I learned my lesson on this. I was just a young judge. I gave in. I did it, okay? The next time I saw her at a hearing, which was a disposition hearing, okay, um, she told me that she regretted, pushing to have her son detained because now he's getting all these phone calls from gang members that he met in the detention center.
I'm not at all
So,
surprised by that. In fact, the only part that is surprised is that she acknowledges that, and that she's willing to say that she regrets it. Because
yes,
most of the people aren't going to be honest enough to admit that. The legislators that vote for unwinding this piece or that piece are the ones that voted for that ugly bill last year. They're not going to have to come back and eat crow because none of them are going to be at risk of being hit by the parts they voted on. It's not real to
right.
them. It doesn't touch their lives. It's not likely to touch their kids or grandkids' lives, and so they can be distant and remote from it. And it doesn't hit home, which is a shame because there are lots of families for whom it does hit home. It hits directly, and it does harm unnecessarily so.
Yeah. And I earlier comment you were talking about in terms of, reducing disproportionate, uh, racial numbers. I want my viewers, I want to put this in context with my viewers that, because there's always those out there and say, well, more black and brown kids commit crimes anyway. And so, of course, you're going to
Oh my
have a
gosh, the
higher
number of
number.
times I've heard they'll never say that in public.
Right?
My fellow caucus members I've heard say that. That is
Yeah.
that's a
Yeah.
truly upsetting, racist, bigoted mindset that is much more pervasive than I thought it ever could have been.
Yeah. So, so when we were pushing in our reform, um, back in 2013, the to mandate what I was using in my county when kids were presented to us as to whether they should be detained, which we called a detention assessment instrument. Some people call them the RAI, the risk assessment instrument.
Yeah.
And it did pass unanimously. Okay. But here's the thing. When we started using the detention assessment instrument to ensure that the kids who are not public safety risk do not get put into detention, okay? But there are safe alternatives, whether it's a GPS monitor, electronic monitor. We had a whole bunch of different alternatives helped out by the sheriff's department, okay, in terms of monitoring these kids and so forth. But the bottom line is this: we had we, we reduced the number of African American kids going into detention by over 50%. Okay. All right. Now, that says something because that meant that we were detaining 50% more African American kids that shouldn't have been detained. So that means there was some subjective decision making that allowed those kids to be detained that otherwise shouldn't have been detained. Okay. And I think I want to put that in context for viewers that, you know, that that there are best practices to help us not to be subjective, but to work objectively in making these decisions. And because they hear this stuff about people hear this stuff about racial, you know, the numbers there, and that we're trying to reduce, and if we don't share that part of it, that well, we have done it, okay, where it's race neutral, you know, it's race neutral. Adolf Hitler wouldn't have been able to lock up a Jewish kid using this instrument, okay, all right. Um, that if you have that reduction in numbers of black youth, then that begs the question: why were we detaining them in the first
Sure
place?
enough, does.
Okay, yeah. So another thing I want to you had mentioned earlier about the fiscal responsibility, which is a core thing in terms of conservative
It
values.
is.
Fiscal. It is okay. Y'all saved money in these reforms, did you not?
We did. We did. So in Kentucky at the time, so this is now 10, 11 years old, going on 12 years old, but it was costing us over 50% of our DJJ budget. I think at the time was 55 million out of a $100 million budget. So a bit over 50% of our budget was spent on out of home placements. We spent, it was right about the time we passed the bill, it was just over $100,000 per kid per bed per year. If you annualize that cost, which is just a crazy amount. When we spend a fraction of that on adults, it's criminal that we spend so much more to detain our juveniles in a similar sort of environment that way. Instead of community-based treatment, when you think about the cost of detaining a child out of home, which is an artful way of saying in a detention facility, it the cost is ridiculous. And then I compare that to the cost to make them a member at the local Boys and Girls Club. At the time, about $350 a year. If you were to factor in all the different parts and pieces, what the cost is to that kid, to be able to pay to have that kid have access to mentorship, educational programs, vocational training and programs, physical fitness things, health things, and adults that want to love on that kid and invest and pour themselves into the life of that child, specific to that child. When you think about the better outcomes we get from that sort of investment versus detention, I mean, the math becomes so lopsided in favor of a community-based response. It's comical we ever did something different. There's a place in Boston, and I had a chance to tour it a decade ago. You may have been to it at some point in the past too. It's called Roca, or the Roca House, ROCA. It's not residential. It's not a detention program. It's just a mentorship and vocational training program, and they only cater to the worst of the worst offenders. So the kids that in Kentucky, there'd be no debate about locking up in a detention facility. Roca only deals with them, and they've got a culinary. They've got chefs from it's in Chelsea, Massachusetts, though I think they may have other locations as well. But so they've got people from Boston that come over, and 4 and 5 star chefs that teach them how to cook and prepare dishes. They've got master carpenters that show them how to handle wood and become a carpenter. And in fact, the time that
Wow.
they spend in that can be used towards their apprenticeship hours, because Massachusetts has that sort of setup for that career. All these things, and they invest in those kids, and they have a single-digit recidivism rate. Single digit. I mean, it's mind-blowing the scarce number of participants in that program that go on to commit anything. Most of them don't. And they talked about how they've got 4 and 5 star chefs that have graduated from their program that are on cruise ships or in restaurants in New York City, and then master carpenters that were in that program. There's a place in San Diego that started as an honest to goodness just dream job for this guy in corporate America. It's called David's Harp, HARP. He was interested in the music industry. He and a childhood best friend wanted to set up a recording studio in San Diego. They did. And to make a long story short, neighborhood kids found out about it and wouldn't leave the man alone. They would just wanted to be able to record and be in the music industry. And now there's an entire mission set up.
Wow.
To get, and I've been and seen the studio. I've been with other legislators and even recorded some stuff in there. And they've got state of the art equipment. And then they've got a video production house in there and photography stuff set up in there. All of these things, and they're changing children's lives. The same kids who would otherwise be in a prison facility somewhere for juveniles, learning from the worst. Instead, people are investing in those kids. That's the sort of investment that kids need. And when you look at the outcomes and when you look at the cost, this whole rabbit hole I'm going down here was started a discussion about cost. It's a fraction of what it takes to just sit them in a cell somewhere with razor wire out front. It's a fraction of it. And you talked earlier, Judge, about your experience, pre-COVID, to be able to get off the bench and hug that kid, talk to that kid or that kid's parents.
Yeah.
That's what these missions and these different efforts get to do. They get to see and talk and hug and love on and care for that kid face to face and invest in that kid. When the kid screws up, they're held accountable. But they're not shut out forever. They're not shunned to a life and doomed to a life of just crime. They pay the penalty they've got, and they're welcomed back. We're going to give you another chance. We're going to give you grace and hope. That's something our systems don't give. As a Christian, as a believer, I want the systems to provide that as much as possible. I need grace, and I need hope. I don't know why the kids that have less than I ever had growing up don't need it any more or much more than I do. We should have a system that provides that.
Well, I'm looking at one of my notes here, and I went to it because of what you said, and it's under the conservative core value that I mentioned earlier to you, and that you acknowledge is a core value as strengthening families, communities, and under it is one of my bullet points that says programs that allow for rehabilitation and reintegration into society strengthen families by keeping parents at home and productive rather than behind bars. Okay. It's about building families, not destroying families, because you're right, it's not productive in prison. And especially if you're not somebody that we're looking at that is going to be, the next rapist, the next murderer. We're not talking necessarily about those where there are some immediate consequences. It's a matter of public safety that's a high risk. We get that. I've had to send my share of kids
Sure.
to prison, but I also created a second chance program for those high risk kids, like you're mentioning these people have done. And so the recidivist rate I mentioned earlier at 65% for those kids who went to youth prison in Georgia, this program is 17% recidivist rate.
That's so good, man. That's a wildly successful program.
Yeah. Now, and about your costs mentioned, for example, in Georgia, it costs $92,000 a year to house a kid in a prison. Okay. All right. Where if you keep them in the community, it's $5,000 to $10,000.
That's right.
Okay. And that goes to the conservative value of fiscal responsibility and cost effectiveness. You get better numbers by increasing public safety on $5,000 to $10,000, okay, by keeping them in the community and providing those programs that we do know that works, that can help to restructure their thinking. And they're at the best point, right, to restructure
exactly
because
right.
their brain's not fully developed.
There's also unknowable advantages and fiscal advantages to this sort of approach as well, because there's avoided cost. You're not just not housing that kid in a detention cell today, but you're likely not housing them in an adult facility down the road. You're not sustaining their life with some sort of other public benefit down the road, or their family members with public benefits and helps down the road. There's a ton, and it's unknowable, right? You just never know what you can't prove a negative, but you have to realize that when you change the course of their lives to a better path, you're keeping the state and the taxpayer from having to foot the bill for 100 other things for the next 20 or 30 years.
Oh, absolutely. And, and the concerns that I have right now with what's going on in Washington with this chainsaw approach to cutting things, I take a look, and they're bringing up, there's been some discussion of Medicaid and Medicare, but there's always the attacking what they call the welfare state. But here's the thing, there's no doubt that there should always be a second look at all programs we're doing to ensure fiscal responsibility. There's no
Well,
doubt.
and that second look should examine whether or not it's actually doing what it's intended to do. There's nothing wrong with
That's
that.
it.
In fact, that's
Right,
a very
right.
conservative principle. What's happening in D.C. now isn't that. It's ego service and performative politics writ large on 24-hour cable news, and I don't have any use for that. And it's a shame because there are a lot of really important things, programs, not to mention people's lives that are impacted adversely because of these cuts here, there, and yonder that aren't informed, but gives Elon Musk a chance to stand on a stage at CPAC with a dumb chainsaw. It's frustrating to see such ignorance and incompetence give such incredible power.
I agree. I think, going back to, as an example, if you take a look at, let's say, the TANF, food stamps, and all those things, the fact of the matter is, we do know one thing, that the majority of people who receive those things is helping them to survive.
That's
Okay,
right.
all right, helping them survive. Here's the unintended consequences to the community if we cut those things. They can't survive, but they will try to survive.
That's
And
man.
how do you think they're going to do it?
That is.
When instead, yeah. So the food stamp TANF, it's an investment in people.
It
It's
is.
also an investment in public safety. Okay, you know, and I just wish that policymakers, particularly those today at the federal level, would think of the unintended consequences. Okay, get this. I think if they thought about the unintended consequences, it would be on them, even though I'm not really sure they're thinking of the unintended consequences on the American citizen. Okay, that
Oh, they're clearly
because
not.
of you mentioned ego. Yeah. So get this. I couldn't help it when our president said he wants to make Canada the 51st state.
Lord
So
have
I,
mercy.
I so I looked it up. If Canada was made the 51st state, okay, which political party
Oh
would
my!
they lean toward?
The irony that has not penetrated his brain. I don't get it. Like,
they're,
and there are Republicans in Congress that are spouting it too and repeating it. And I
yeah,
don't understand how, if you really just wanted to be talking about rank politics and nothing else, have you worked the math out there, Mr. President? Have you figured out how
yeah,
that changes the red blue ratio we've got going on?
yeah. So I studied this. So the two major parties in Canada is the Liberal Party, and then there's the New Democrat Party. Okay, all right. So I asked, well, how many representatives would that create based upon the population of Canada? They said 43. Okay. Then
I
I
think the
said,
House
how
enjoys
many?
what, like a third of a person member majority right now. I mean, it's that
Right,
slim.
right. So how many electoral college votes would that be? 59.
Oh my gosh.
That means there will never be another Republican president. See, they're not thinking about this. It's like they're just saying things, and it's creating this chaos, and it's hectic, just like just to make noise
It,
without really thinking
as I
about it.
said, it is in service of political ends or it's performative for some other selfish or self-aggrandizing reason. It is not useful to the people of America, not to mention Canada. It's not useful to the world order. And it's destructive and corrosive to our constitutional order here in the United States.
Yes.
That doesn't seem to factor in with too many members of Congress or in the Republican Party, which I regret to say is what I continue to see. And we're gonna be paying for this for a long time because it's doing a lot of harm.
Yeah. Well, and going back to your reference to DEI, one of the things that I don't understand, and probably, folks, probably we would do better if we reframed it semantically, okay? But the fact of the matter is that I know. There,
Sorry, Amanda was heading out to go get the big kids from school. Sorry about that.
okay, no, you're fine, you're fine. So here's the thing. Um, you know, I know there's a lot of there's been brought up the phrase the woke culture. Okay, I get that. Okay, but in terms of DEI, I thought we woke up in the 1960s with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, and then the Voting Rights
Yeah,
Act. So and the Title VII, I know I know Title VII well. Having to defend on actions when I was with the Attorney General's office, okay, representing state agencies. No, but the word prevention is not used, but it's very strongly inferred that in order to avoid a civil rights action, you need to be doing things to prevent things in the workplace. Okay, you need to do things to ensure that you are not violating, you're not, you know, uh, that you're not dismissing a person because of the color of their skin, or that you're not hiring them because of the color of their skin. But today, the way that they're defining, this anti-DEI, you might as well gut Title VII.
yeah. Look, there's just patent racism among my party, and you can find people that absolutely would just soon not have the Civil Rights Act at all. Kentucky has its own, like most states, has its own Civil Rights Act that followed the federal Title VII. Most of the efforts that are opposed to DEI issues in higher education here in Kentucky and elsewhere, most of them I think are unconstitutional or at best unnecessary because we have Title VII, because we have the Civil Rights Act at the federal level and at the state level. We've got the Civil Rights Act in Kentucky that already guarantees protections for minorities and makes sure that our environment, whether it's in government or in the private sector, uh, approaches minorities with equity. And it's clear that there's a desire amongst some that they just rather get rid of that. And it's troubling to hear that. It goes back to what we said earlier. I mean, there are members of legislatures around the country who just think black and brown kids are more likely to commit crimes than white kids. There are legislators that believe black and brown adults are just more likely. They're just more prone, more apt to be criminal than their white counterparts, which of course is just repugnant, gross, and false. But it gives me great alarm to learn or to see any time when those ideas gain purchase in the minds of legislatures in the form of these bills that look fine, that appear race neutral, that in their text are race neutral, but won't it all be race neutral in their effect? Or that won't it all be smooth and equitable in their impact on the people that the law applies to? So it's unnerving, and it all goes back to the point from before on our juvenile justice work. There's a desire to be performative. There's a desire to look like you're doing something that's tough, and most, not all. I'm thankful that there are plenty of legislators in Kentucky I know and have all the respect for in the world that dig deep into the policies that come across their desks. And they want to do it right, and they want to do it well. But there are some that just don't care. They just want to be able to tweet that they did the thing, or get on their Facebook Live and said they did the thing. And it's troubling, and we're reminded that there's nothing new under the sun. This is certainly the first time I've dealt with this as an adult in my lifetime, and it's unnerving. I hope we get out of this terrible phase soon.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, I know historically we've been through some things that are similar. I think this is more on steroids, like Richard Nixon when he tried to freeze funding and Congress came back with the Impoundment Act. And that's the other thing too I don't understand is that I think it was Voight, who said that the Impoundment Act is unconstitutional. Well, consider this. If it's unconstitutional, then that means it's going to take away the power of the presidency because people don't understand. It's not the Impoundment Act that itself prevents, okay, the executive to interfere with the power of the purse of Congress. That's already in the Constitution. It's already unconstitutional. The Impoundment Act was passed simply acknowledging the constitutional principle of the Congress's power of the purse and that the executive cannot interfere with it. What the Impoundment Act did and why it was passed, okay, was to extend to the executive the mechanism that if you do want to freeze something, you can request Congress, okay, and we can set a hearing for it. But if we don't set a hearing,
you're opening up a whole new vista of stuff we could complain about. The depth and breadth of what Congress has given up in its authority, either directly through legislation or through inaction and omission. We don't have enough podcast storage space in the cosmos.
You're right.
For all that.
You're right.
Even now, the Congress is, as I believe, derelict in just, I think, asking honest to goodness questions about what all's happening. And I keep wanting to scream at the Republican members of our congressional delegation, and I know them all. I believe I'm friendly with all of them, and a couple of them I know well and can text a handful of them and have when I'm annoyed about this or that or the other. There's only one Democrat in the bunch. He and I served together in the Senate for a time in the state Senate, Morgan McGarvey from Kentucky's 3rd, that's Louisville. But the rest of them are Republican, and I keep wanting to scream at them and say, if President Kamala Harris was doing what you see Donald Trump doing right now, you'd be apoplectic. You'd be absolutely beside yourself with rage. You'd be talking about it on Fox or one of the even worse terrible news outlets, One America or Newsmax, which I don't even consider to be honest to goodness news. You'd be on Twitter. You'd be demanding hearings and investigations. And it'd be more performative nonsense to be sure in there, but at least there'd be some analysis and you'd want to ask questions about what's going on and how they're doing it. Their reluctance to lift a finger to even inquire, to exercise their constitutional, their Article 1 duties to investigate what's happening in the executive branch, it's scary. David French, author and writer for the New York Times, said a few years ago, or he has said before, others have said, and he's not the first one to say it. Nick Catoggio with the Dispatch has said this too, that every president, and I think this applies to Congress too, sets a new floor. The next president's not going to be better. They're going to do everything the last president did, and they're going to justify it by saying, well, that's what the last president did, and y'all didn't fuss at that.
Right.
Donald Trump's pardons for January 6th, folks, which is just awful and terrible, and I'd hate. But he justified it, at least in part, because of Joe Biden's pardons on the way out the door of family members. I think he probably would have pardoned January 6th folks anyway, but there have been people speculating or maybe reporting that he has said or internally said, well, screw it, I'm definitely going to do it now. The next president will look at what Trump has done. The next Congress will look at what this Congress has done and use that to justify what they do. I don't know what it's going to take to shake them all loose, to actually do their jobs. But I sure wish it happened because it's like that line, where am I going and why am I in this handbasket?
Right. I love it. Well, in closing out, there's a couple of things that I wanted to check off here on my core conservative value list. You know, we've already talked about fiscal responsibility, cost effective, public safety, and crime reduction. Things that you've done that aren't the traditional tough on crime optic approach, but yet it is increased public safety, it's crime reduction, fiscally responsible, save the state money, okay, the Commonwealth of Kentucky. We've talked about personal responsibility and accountability,
Yep.
okay, that's a conservative value, okay. Um, and and then in a way but we haven't said it, and I just want to check this off, see what your thoughts on limited government and avoiding overreach, okay, that, I mean, over incarceration of people means building more prisons, okay, you know, that in a limited sense, okay, is not having a limited government, okay. And then we talked about strengthening families and communities. And then the last one, I guess we really have, and the last one, and I have a note here, a core conservative value is faith and redemption. Okay. And, I've acknowledged here many conservatives hold faith based principles that emphasize second chances and redemption. The belief in rehabilitation aligns with the idea that individuals can change, especially with the right support. And so, I guess in terms of today, we see how many of evangelical Christians are following the, the president and those who are the tough on crime without being smart on crime. Okay, but these policies that the evangelical Christians are supporting, I mean, whatever happened to you know
You
forgiveness?
you want to
What
know what
happened to
my
mercy?
my answer to that is, Judge? It's addiction to earthly power, political power, and the prioritization of that power over the values or principles that any of them ever claimed to have held in the first place. All those things you just have rattled off are all principles of conservatism that I'm familiar with, and as an evangelical Christian myself, I believe in completely. But it's their willingness to sacrifice that in service of political power or influence. I mean, there are efforts to compel the teachings of Christ in public schools. I think I read something. There's some effort to teach effort to make it compulsory for some sort of faith-based education. I think it was in Texas. I read that in the last few days. Um, because we can ends up being the motivating factor because we've got the chance to do it now. Well, no, that's not what God's word says. That's not what conservative principles say. That's not what the Constitution for sure says. The U.S. Constitution or Kentucky's Constitution, or I assume Georgia's or Arizona's. Um, I want us to win on the merits of our ideas. And I believe that we can win on the merits of our ideas. But sort of like my faith witness as a Christian, it's diminished if I am willing to abandon it in service of some short-term objective.
Yeah.
If my principles to conservatism are abandoned in service of some short-term political win, then what does that say about my principles in the first place? How sacred are they to me if I'm willing to give them
Hmm.
up just a little bit to get just a little bit of more power, influence, or authority over X, Y, or Z? And I think that's really what it boils down to. And that addiction, that power comes in different forms. Maybe it's one legislator's desire to grow their clout with the right base on social media. Maybe it's because they're gunning for a congressional seat in the next cycle. Maybe they want to lay a trap or a political trap in a primary for somebody in the upper chamber. Whatever it is, it's their desire to achieve that overpowers their adherence to or adhesion to those principles in the first place. And it really highlights just how lightly some folks held those principles in the first place. Um, and it troubles me as an evangelical Christian, because I believe the witness of Christians everywhere is diminished by so many people doing things that are antithetical to the teachings of Christ completely. I mean, there was some guy I saw it on Twitter last week. I think he's a member of Congress, but he said that, or maybe he's a member of the administration. He's in the cabinet somewhere. If I find it, Judge, I'll send it to you. But there was a quote where he said, "What about the golden rule? What you do to me, I'm gonna do to you." And I was like, "No, no, golly, no, no,
That's not what
no,
it says.
no." I just like, do I need to point you to the chapter and verse in the Bible that says just
Right,
how
right.
wrong you are?
Yeah,
For those who don't know, what you want done to you, do unto others.
unto, right,
Do unto others as you'd have done to you. So treat other
right.
people the way you want to be treated.
Want to be
I
treated.
want to be
Yeah,
treated with civility and kindness. I should treat others with civility and kindness, even when they don't. Um, I
right.
think it's an addiction to earthly power and influence and short-term political advantage or gain that gets people to let go of their principles for whatever purpose on whatever policy issue of the day.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. You remind me. I was raised Southern Baptist. Okay,
I
in
was too.
fact, yeah, and in fact, I served many years on the deacon board. I was chair of the deacon body, um, and one of our preachers, God rest his soul, he once said, I remember this was in a deacon meeting, and he said, "Look," he said, "folks, we don't need the state getting involved in what we're supposed to be doing. When we start, you know, sanctioning things that we should be doing, like witnessing to other people, being evangelical, and we make it state law, then what's going to be the role of the church?"
Yeah,
Okay, you know, you know, I mean, there's a reason why the scripture says to tithe 10%. So those monies can go to support the spread of the word of Christ. Okay, but if we start legislating this in violation of the Establishment Clause, then then the problem is that people don't get to heaven because there's a law that says that everyone has to worship this one God.
that's right.
Okay, that doesn't get you to heaven. Okay, you know, it's based upon your own personal work and belief and your conduct. Okay, that demonstrates that you're doing. So I get exactly what you're saying. You are right on point. Well, Senator, there's one thing I do want to say before we close. I You have shown just remarkable courage throughout your tenure as a leader in the Kentucky Senate, okay? And you continue to demonstrate that. I I admire you because you are still a Republican. You are still devoted to the party, and I don't ever want a true conservative like you leaving the Republican Party or dismissing it because I hear people leaving, you know, the Republican Party. I read that here and there, or they're quitting their jobs, and I'm going, please don't do that. We need to have sensible voices, okay, that are speaking really true conservative values, okay. And you just have demonstrated so much courage.
I,
Uh,
I
in
appreciate that. I don't think I've demonstrated enough.
Well, I would disagree with you on that. Okay, you
I
have.
appreciate it.
I just think that because of the way things may be going right now, and that you may feel that you haven't, but there's only so much that a person can do, and you have gone beyond what in any definitely way beyond what the average person like yourself, okay? And I appreciate you so very much, and I'm glad to call you a friend.
Likewise, Judge.
Well, all right, this has been great. So I'm going to go ahead and call this a close. I ask my viewers. I hope that you've learned something here. If no matter where you are in the political spectrum, I think this has been a good conversation because the focus has been on conservatism in terms of policy making and what that should look like. And we've had a fighter in the trenches here for many years. So, with that said, until next time, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you are walking away and trying to reimagine uh, what real and good justice looks like.